Welcome to Block 13, Broken Star of the Cheshire Quilters Guild 2018 Block of the Month. This is for July. This is the second of two blocks. The other block is Block 12, Star of Hope, so look for that video also. We're going to start by making a square and square, which is our fabric A and the triangles of fabric F. So we're going to sew two sides on, press the seam toward the triangles, and then put the other two seams on and press toward the triangles. So I'm going to do those two steps, and I'll be back here to show you how to trim it up. After you sew on the first two sides, you might want to just take your rotary cutter and just nip off the dog ears that stick out on the sides to make it easier to line up your triangles. And the way I sew these is with the triangle on the bottom, so that I can see that I've fairly well centered the triangle, so that I can see that I've fairly well lined up the triangle, because when you flip it over you can see the ears sticking out on either side, and so I try to make both of them about the same size, and then I can sew my 1/4 inch seam. Okay, meet you back here to trim it up after I get the other two sides sewn on. Here's my square and a square with my 4 seams sewn on, and again I've pressed all the seams away from the square toward the triangles. And so what we want to do now is trim it up, and it's going to be 4 3/4, so each of these points needs to be 2 3/8 inch from the edge, and so that's how I'm going to line up the ruler. The points are going to be 1/4 inch from the side and 2 3/8 inches from, okay, 1/4 inch, 2 3/8. Oh, that's too far. Nope, that's just perfect. Okay, there we are. So I'm at 2 3/8 on this side and this side, and even at the other points I'm at 2 3/8. So I'm nice and square to the unit. And I trim these two sides, put those away. Now when I turn around, it's easier to line up because I can just put my 4 1/2 inch lines on, or sorry, 4 3/4 lines on the outside of my unit. My seams are at 1/4 inch and at 2 3/8, 2 3/8 and 1/4 inch, 2 3/8 and 1/4 inch. I did a good job sewing my 1/4 inch seams. If yours doesn't come out, it's because you've either sewn your 1/4 inch seams too fat or too small. If your square sticks out too much, then you aren't taking a big enough seam, and if it's too far in so that it doesn't measure, see, across, it's going to measure 4 1/4, and then there's a 1/4 inch seam on each side. So if this square doesn't measure 4 1/4 across from point to point, then you're making your seams too big, and you need to pick them out and try again. And if you have trouble with it, after you do the first one, you might want to use some scrap fabric to practice to make sure it comes out right. But there it is. There's my square and a square. Alright, the next thing to do is to sew fabric C triangles onto my fabric A squares. And the way in which you're going to do this, here's my square. I'm going to set it on point just so you can see the orientation we want. And we're going to sew the triangles on, and we're going to do it like we're doing the square and the square, where we center them on the sides. But we're going to do it on one side, press toward that triangle, and then do the other side and press toward the triangle. So we're just going to put them on 2 of the sides, not on all 4 sides. And I'll meet you back here when I've got them sewn. Again, we're going to press toward the triangles. So I'll see you back here in just a couple minutes. Okay, so there's one of my corner units. And what I want to do is trim it up now. And if you have a ruler that has the intersecting 45-degree lines, this is very convenient for trimming up the 1/4 inch seam on the one side, because that's what we want to trim first. And you can do that by putting the 45-degree lines on the two seams, and then you'll see there's your 1/4 inch seam across the top so that you don't lose your point. Okay, the other thing that needs to be done to these is to trim them to 4 3/4 inches wide. And so the seam intersections are 2 3/8 from each side. And to do this, I would put the ruler, a solid line on the ruler at the top of the unit, and then you can measure over 2 3/8. That's not quite far enough. There we go, about 2 3/8. And you're just going to trim off a little bit on each side. Now once you've got one side trimmed, the other side will be at 4 3/4. So I'm putting 4 3/4 on the side I've already trimmed. I've got a straight line, a nice solid line on the bottom, and I'm going to trim off for 4 3/4. And if we look, that center is again at 2 3/8. So that's how I would use a regular ruler to trim this up. Now, some of you may have a wing clipper, and that's another convenient tool for trimming the top. Now the wing clipper does not have neither wing clipper 1 or 2. It allows you to trim something 4 3/4 inches wide, but all we have to do is put one of those X's at the top. Put one of those X's at the top, and it gives you one line that will go along the seam, and then it again allows you to trim that 1/4 inch off on the top, but it does not give you the ability to trim the width at the 4 3/4. So for that, again, we're going to use a straight line, measure over 2 3/8, 2 3/8. Trim one side, rotate the unit, 4 3/4 and a solid on the bottom, and there we go. This should still be at 1 2 3/8. Beautiful. So there's that one trimmed up. So I'm going to trim up the remaining two, because in step 6 you're asked to make 4 of these. So I'm going to trim up the remaining 2, and I'll meet you back here for the next thing that we need to do. Okay, so now we're going to make some flying geese, and we're going to do that by first drawing diagonal lines across the backs of our fabric E squares. Sorry, you can't really see that. Let me move it up where you can see. So I'm lining up, and it would be on the 45 line. And so I'm just drawing a line quickly on the back of each one of these squares. That's going to be the line that I'll use to follow when I'm doing the actual stitching. Okay. So I drew lines on the back of them, and I'm going to start by taking 2 of the squares, and I'm going to lay them on opposite corners of the fabric A square. The key thing here is that the thing you want to do is to make sure the lines line up and meet in the middle. And I'm leaving them, I'm pushing the squares just a tad in from the corner, so just a few threads of the underlying squares shows through. And there I've got my line straight through the middle. I'm going to take the sewing machine, I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch on either side, and I'll meet you back here after I get that done. Okay, now I've stitched on both sides, so the next thing to do is to cut them apart along the drawn line. And now I'm going to take these over, and I'm going to press these small triangles away from the resulting large triangle. I'll meet you back here when I've got that done. Okay, so here's the result after I get them pressed. And I take my remaining 2 squares and I line them up the same way with just a little peak of fabric A showing out and the line going from the point out. And I'm going to take these over to my sewing machine. I'm going to sew on either side of those also. Press away, and I'll separate. After I stitch, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to cut along the drawn line, and I'm going to press the small triangles away. This is the 5 square method, or the no waste method, or the fast flying geese method, which you may have done before, and so this shouldn't be too big a deal. I'll see you back here when it's time to trim, because this size we're going to trim to is a little peculiar. Alright, so we're going to trim this goose just like we trimmed the corner units. I'm laying the intersecting 45s on the corners so I can get a nice straight edge on that side of my flying geese. And now I'm going to use the I'm going to measure it to be 2 5/8 inches wide. So I'm just going to measure 2 5/8 inches from the line I just trimmed up. And then I'm going to measure 2 3/8 inches from the middle. See, I'm trying to make sure I've got both this bottom and then 1 2 5/8 up to that side, over 2 3/8. And it should, if you've sewn everything properly, it should go right through the seam intersection at the corner. And then turn it around, do it again. It's going to be 4 3/8 inches wide, 4 3/8 inches wide, 2 5/8 tall, and again it should be come out right near the seam intersection down here.
Next, I'll trim up the other 3.
And then we'll see what we need to do next. So there's our finished flying geese. And now we're going to take these and we're going to sew them onto our corner units that we made. We made 4 corner units. So each one of these is going to get sewn to a flying geese like that. And we're going to press the seam toward the flying geese. So these should line up exactly. Remember, we sewed both of them, we trimmed both of them to be 4 3/4 inches. And I would sew with the flying geese on the bottom so you can watch this seam on the top so it doesn't get all crinkled up in your seam. Your stitching should, because we trimmed this to 1/4 inch, your stitching should go right through that point so that when we press toward the flying geese, you're not going to lose this point. It'll be just perfectly lined up like that. So I'm going to do those 4 and press them, and I'll come back here so we can see what the next thing is we need to do. Okay, so here's my corner units with the added flying goose, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 of them and sew them on either side of our square in the square. This is going to end up being kind of the center of our block, and when we do this, because we've got seams crossing here from both the flying geese and the square, we're going to press these 2 seams open. I'll be back when that's done. So there we are, there's the center section. So the next thing we need to do is make the side sections. Each of those is going to be a corner section with our flying goose, and then you're going to sew 2 triangles, fabric A triangles, 1 on either side. And the easiest way to sew these on is to line up the square edge and feed it through your sewing machine like this, and then on the other one turn it over and again feed it through with the square edges lined up and stitch from the side rather than from the pointed end. So I'm going to stitch those together. We're going to make 2 of those side sections, and I'll meet you back here so we can look at what the block is going to look like. And there you have the arrangement that we need to create Broken Star. We've got 2 side sections on either side, and you'll notice their seams are going to match up perfectly because of our trimming. So what you want to do is sew these together, and we're going to press the seams open because we're going to have a flying geese against the square and a square seam, so the best thing is going to be to press those open, and then we'll trim it to size to 12.5 by 12.5. I'll meet you back here to see how we do that. Well, there you have it, Broken Star. We just now need to trim it to 12.5 by 12.5. I happen to have a 12.5-inch ruler, which makes it really easy. But let me give you some tips on how you can trim yours accurately also. First of all, a 45 line should go right through the points of your square and a square, your flying geese, and your corner units. Second thing is the middle is going to be at 6.25 inches. So in our middle, it measures 3 inches across. So if we put the 6.25 lines right in the middle, now I'm 1.5, the center square, measures 3 inches. So I've got 1.5 inches above to the top. From the middle, I'm 1.5 inches to each side of the square and 1.5 inches to the bottom. So you're going to line that up as even as you can, and make sure that you have your diagonal going through the center. Now that should line up such that basically all you're going to be doing is trimming off these middle triangles. So we do that on 2 sides. Brush that out of the way. Turn your square 180 degrees, and then line it up again the same way, where you're from the 6.25, you're up 1.5 inches, across 1.5 inches, this way 1.5 inches, down 1.5 inches. So you've got your 3-inch square, and your diagonal goes through. Not very well. And your diagonal goes through, and then again, it's just really those center sections where you're going to have some fabric to trim off. And once we do that, there we have it. Block 13, Broken Star, the second block for July 2018. So the other block this month is block 12, Star of Hope, so look for that video separately. So next month we have 2 blocks also, and so in August look forward to block 14, Star of Beauty, and block 15, Star of Destiny. And that's it for July for Cheshire Quilters Guild 2018 block of the month.